Okay, we're going to start our 1920s unit. Well, we started it yesterday with a discussion post on change, conflict, and cooperation. Today, we're going to get into the first topic that's going to help you do your homework assignment that's due tonight. Today's topic is going to be on the Red Scare and Nativism. In the discussion post yesterday, I said that the 20s was a dynamic decade, meaning that America was becoming more modern, and for many historians, the 20s is the first modern decade. We said that there's all kinds of changes. We're going to see changes in technology, changes in population and demographics, changes in roles for women and race relations. But not only is there going to be a ton of changes, we're also going to see conflicts and at times the good side of it, cooperation or new relationships. But the 20s starts off as a time of conflict, and it's what we refer to as the Red Scare. In class, we would be using these two links that are here on the Canvas page. So I'm going to click those to make sure to get them open. And I would definitely encourage you to check those out. The Red Scare is a fear of communism or a fear of socialism that overtook America after World War I. This first part here where it says Red Scare in-class research, it has a reading from a guy named A. Mitchell Palmer, and this reading is called The Case Against the Red. And he works for the American government. He's the American Attorney General, and he is explaining why communism is dangerous to our country. At the end of World War I, Russia became the very first communist government, and there was a real fear in 1919, 1920, 1921 of communist ideas and socialist ideas becoming more popular in America. I'm trying to think, a connection to this, or just like a side effect of this, is as he ramps up the anti-communist rhetoric, that really turns into anti-immigrant rhetoric. And if you remember this from the Gilded Age, the late 1800s through up about 1920 is the largest period of immigration in American history. And much of that immigration was what we would call new immigrants coming from places like Southern and Eastern Europe. And so when A. Mitchell Palmer starts really coming out fierce against communism, what he's really saying is we need to be concerned about Eastern European immigrants, people from Russia or other Eastern European states that might be bringing in radical ideas. And we would read through this in class and we would talk a little bit about it. What I want you to then see is how certain things that happened in the early 1920s reflect this fear of communism. And that's where the other document comes in. Okay, and this will help you on the assignment, the cartoon that's called The Only Way to Handle It. Side note, before we start talking about this Red Scare in the 1920s, we might refer to as the first or the smaller Red Scare. Later on, after World War II in the 1950s, there's going to be a much larger fear of communism that's going to erupt into a much bigger Red Scare. So sometimes the Red Scare is used for the 20s or the 50s. This 1920s one is the smaller version of this. But look at some of the stuff that happens. The first thing to catch is these things known as the Quota Act of 1921, or what's sometimes called the Immigration Act of 1924. Because of fear of communism and fear of Eastern European immigrants, our government in 1921, for the first time, restricts immigration across the board, kind of a blanket restriction. And what they did is they put quotas that restricted immigration from an annual inflow of these numbers all the way down to an annual inflow of these numbers. If you look at the black and the lighter shaded, this lighter shade is those new immigrants, immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. So again, They were the largest group coming to our country in the 19 teens. And then when we start passing quotas in 1921, it drops those numbers way down. But actually, for older immigrants, it really wasn't that much of a restriction. It really singled out new immigrants. And if you get into the details of how those laws were formed, it has to do with census data and certain target years and cutoff years. So, for example, in the Emergency Quota Act, it cut down annual inflow to 3% of the existing immigrant population in the year 1890. I'm not going to ask you to know all those particulars, but that's why it was able to single out this group and not as much this group. Then our country was still so kind of stirred up of anti-communist feeling that 3 years later we passed a second immigration act that tightens those restrictions all the way down um, to these numbers. Here's the point. And this is the cartoon that you're working on. These cartoons were published 1919 and 1921 in the context of the Red Scare and a fear of immigration. And being that these were done in 1919 and 1921, and we know that further restrictions are coming, you can tell that most people in America that were not immigrants probably embraced these ideas and, as an audience, demanded that the government go further in the restrictions. Another piece of evidence of these anti-immigrant or fear of communist thinking in the 1920s is the rise of the KKK. Now, this is something for a lot of students that they're surprised at because they always associate the KKK with being anti-Black Americans. And the KKK's origins were, during the Reconstruction period after the Civil War, predominantly anti-Black. However, in the 1920s, this white supremacy group, this hyper-nationalist group, received their largest membership in American history during the 1920s. The KKK rose to over 1 million official members. And if you notice in these cartoons, the people that they are perpetuating violence against are not African Americans, but instead they are European immigrant Americans, specifically Eastern Europeans from Rome that are associated with Catholicism. The KKK flourished amidst the hysteria of the Red Scare. And again, most people associate the KKK just being anti-Black, but really what they were is they were anti anybody who was not white, Anglo-Saxon ancestry, and Protestant. So if you weren't white, if you weren't from like the English German background, or if you weren't Protestant, so if you were Jewish, atheist, Catholic, which oftentimes people from Eastern Europe were not, then you were going to be the subject of their hate crimes and their violence. One last piece of information that I think is interesting as it relates to this Red Scare stuff is this woman here, Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger is the founder of Planned Parenthood, and her general summary is that she was an advocate for women's reproductive rights and for birth control. And we may come back to this later when we talk about women in the 1920s because she is a pioneer in that sense. However, if you look at some of her own words and why she is an advocate of birth control, she's got some pretty disturbing things. On immigrants and Blacks, she refers to them as human weeds, as human beings who should never have been born. On the purpose of birth control, she says the purpose in promoting birth control was to create a race of thoroughbreds. So Margaret Sanger, more than just being an answer to a trivia question of she promoted birth control, you need to understand her in the context of the Red Scare and Nativism. Her view of restricting births or promoting birth control was a form of blocking immigrants and radical ideas. This is artificial selection. This is a form of eugenics, and these are the type of ideas that even the Nazi Party is going to build off of in Europe when they go on their scheme of racial purification. These are dangerous ideas that obviously we need to push away from, but we also need to understand that they were taking place in the context of this Red Scare and this kind of hyper fear of communism and socialism. Okay, so this was just a quick little lecture on the Red Scare. You can read about it in Module 8, and I think this discussion and these documents should give you some context and some ideas on how to approach that cartoon and the point of view analysis that's due today. Okay, thanks for watching.